Okay, I will go over some details here and then we will get started. Welcome to the next steps when sunsetting an EHR. The presentation will begin in just a moment. Please note that all attendees are in listen-only mode. If you have any questions during the presentation, feel free to send those over in the question window box and we will get to those as we can. Everyone will receive a recording of this webinar and copies of the slides. Those usually come out about a day after the webinar from the GoToWebinar, just like your invite did. Alrighty, next steps when sunsetting an EHR, dealing with legacy EHR and PM. Inquiries, there you go, is a copy of the questions window box. Feel free to send those questions over as you have them. Again, I'll try to get to them during the presentation. If not, we'll hold them to the end and try to get to them, all of them as best we can. Alrighty, about eMedApps. If you haven't attended one of our webinars before, let me give you a few details. eMedApps is a healthcare information technology services company providing practices, clinics, and hospitals with a full range of services, as well as a suite of products designed to increase efficiency and facilitate communication. We were founded in 1999. We've worked with a partner with NextGen since 2001. We work as a subcontractor for NextGen. We serve healthcare clients all across the USA, and we have a line of services and products for NextGen clients, as well as some products for other EHRs as well. Alrighty, go ahead and follow us out there on all of our social media platforms. We're on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn, and we have a YouTube channel. So just go out there and search for eMedApps and follow us. We'd love to have you. Alrighty, about our presenter today. Our presenter is Vic. He is our VP of Product Development. He's been with the company since its founding, and he brings us his experience and deep knowledge of the healthcare community's toughest challenges to consistently deliver excellence, innovation, and success to clients. And a fun fact about Vic, he was a radio DJ while he was in college. Pretty cool. I'll pass it to you, Vic. Thank you.
Thanks, Holly. Welcome, everyone. So I was thinking about how I wanted to kind of talk through this topic here today, and I figured the best way to do this is to break it out into a couple of different areas. The first is sort of operationally, as an organization, what is it that we need to do with that legacy or sunsetted system from both a practice management perspective as well as from the clinical data perspective. What are the steps that I need to take? What makes sense for my organization so that operationally I'm able to continue functioning when I make this transition to the new system? Then sort of a different area of concern is what are my legal requirements? What's the legal compliance that I have to do as an organization to that legacy system that I have? Do I need to keep that EHR running? What are the other options that I have available? So we'll kind of break the talk up into those two different streams, if you will. We'll first start talking about operational impact of transitioning to a new system, and how can I minimize that impact to my organization? What is it that I need to be thinking about? What are the things that I need to look at as I'm transitioning and making that plan to transition? And then we'll kind of switch gears completely and look at it from a legal perspective, and what do I need to do to meet my minimal obligations along the data that's in my legacy system. So start looking at it from an operational perspective. Let's start by looking at that practice management data. Often when you're moving from one system to another, there's a lot of focus on the clinical side in terms of the clinical data that's there, and justifiably so. That's very important data and important for continuity with your patients. But operationally for the organization, the practice management is quite important as well. And so what can I do with the data that's in my practice management system? So conversions very often happen with some of the or subset of the practice management data from that legacy PM to the new PM system. Definitely demographics, a no-brainer, bringing over your patient lists from that legacy system to the new system. Often, this is an opportunity to scrub that data as you've been using that legacy system. Everybody acquires a lot of data in there that is questionable quality at best. And so organizations will use this moment of this transition to clean up some of that data around potential duplicates, patients that were entered that were never seen, things that you don't need to be carrying forward to your new system. So having a plan around scrubbing of this data can be really crucial to ensure that you're not bringing over stuff from the old system that really isn't pertinent or things that you don't want to have in there. Appointment information, transferring this data from the old system to the new system, very beneficial operationally. It prevents a great deal of effort from having to rekey appointment information in the new system. You can look at future appointments. There's really no need for those past appointments in your new system. So just bringing over that future appointment list to your new system, so you have that information available and ready to go, is generally a great idea. There's usually some mapping involved. The new system and the old system, the appointment setups may not be exactly the same. So you have to kind of think about the way appointments were scheduled in that legacy system versus the way they're going to be scheduled in the new system, and how do I map that data across from one site to another. One area where we get a lot of questions when we're dealing with clients is in regards to previous billing visits. So I have open visits in my historic system that have balances due on them. What do I do with that? What do I do with that information? How do I deal with that, and what happens there? So there's generally a lot of complexity in moving billing data from a legacy system to a new system. Billing touches a lot of different areas that you need to think about as part of that conversion of data. So you have to start thinking about things like the claims themselves, the fee schedules associated with those claims, with those charges, I should say, contracts that might be in the system and how those contracts are interpreted from the old system to the new system, payment plans that you've created in the system, how do those translate to the new system? Are there analogous components in the new system that you can store this under? It makes the whole concept of moving billing visits from the legacy system to the new system a very cumbersome task, and potentially a very expensive task as you're transitioning this data. Additionally, one thing you need to keep in mind when you're talking about billing data is there's often a lot of data that's not very clean in the legacy system. If you've been using it for multiple years, everybody deals with the fact that we've got 8 different Aetna pairs built or multiple Cigna pairs built, and we want to take this moment of transitioning to the new system as an opportunity to streamline that process, clean that data up. Well, that becomes a lot more difficult to do if I'm transitioning all that previous billing data over to my new system as well, because I have to bring over that component, or I have to go through a really rigorous mapping to make sure I'm cleaning up the mapping as well as the data itself as part of that conversion. So as a result of that sort of big lift on the billing data, we normally recommend that clinics don't convert accounts receivable data from the old system to the new system. So where does that leave you? When you make this transition, you're going to have outstanding AR in your old system, and how do I deal with that? The cleanest way is to run the AR out of your old system. So keep that old system up and running while I'm running that AR out. All your rebill of claims that are necessary, from denials from the insurance company, where claims have to be corrected, rebuild, handle that all out of the legacy system. All your rules are already built in there for dealing with that data as it was at the time. Your staff is familiar with it. They're able to use that system. So it decreases the sort of the operational overhead of cleaning up that AR and collecting that information. Same thing with things like patient statements and bad debt. It's a little bit cumbersome because your patients might be receiving 2 statements over that interim periods, one from the new system, one from the old system. But the sort of the ease of operations for your organization may make that decision worthwhile. Now, again, there are instances where that's not the right answer, but for the most part, it's a very reasonable way for dealing with this data and bringing it over. You certainly don't want to be running AR out of your legacy system for years, right? So how do I make the decision of when I'm going to cut that off and stop using that legacy system for my AR? A good idea is to set that AR threshold. So what is the AR threshold that that my organization is comfortable with, where at a point it's actually more expensive for my organization to be running AR out of that legacy system than to terminate the legacy system and move entirely to the new system. So come up with that AR threshold as part of your planning process of this migration. What does it mean when I hit that AR threshold? Do I have to write off all those remaining insurance balances? Because I certainly don't want to have to try to track those insurances through my new system and do claims and things like that. That really defeats the purpose of running AR out of the old system. So is that part of my threshold decision on when I can basically turn off and stop using that old system? You certainly can migrate patient balances to the new system. We see this happen all the time. So once I'm done running out AR in my old system, I want to take those patient balances and migrate it to the new system, so that at least if I collect patient payments, bad debt payments, things like that, I'm able to post those into my new system against that balance that's in there and deal with that. So I really can sunset that AR usage of the legacy system and stop using that from within there. So it kind of increases the time that you're on that legacy system and the time that you're using both systems simultaneously. But from a simplicity point of view, from a AR collectability point of view, it may be the right decision for your organization. Let's look at the clinical data. Generally, we break clinical data out of an EHR into 2 categories: discrete data, so things like medications, allergies, lab results, histories, and on problems, procedures, any codified discrete data, vital signs, for example, would fall under this category. The other category are my document-based data, so visit notes, progress notes, any scanned documents that are in the patient's record, any images that are in the patient's record that are attached there. Dermatology, ophthalmology, for example, tend to have a lot of this image data associated with it. Plastic surgery has image data associated with it. So if your specialty has a lot of these images that are attached to the patient record, this would fall under this document data category. And when you're talking about the clinical data from your legacy system, you really need to have a plan to deal with both. Both components are available in that legacy system, and having a robust strategy around both really will help you operationally moving forward once you make that transition into the new EHR system. So for that discrete data, if we kind of focus on that first, what's the real advantage of bringing that discrete data over to my new system? From an operational perspective, it helps maintain productivity in the new system. If I don't have that data in my system, every patient that I'm seeing, as far as my charting is concerned, is basically a new patient, right? Because I'm building histories, I'm putting in med lists, I'm putting in allergy lists, I'm putting in past surgical history, past medical history. So my staff is dealing with that patient as if they're a new patient to the practice, and that's going to have a productivity hit for you as you transition to that new system. Maybe you don't have to convert the data. Maybe I can get to the same purpose by putting in some sort of an abstracting case, and we see this all the time, where the cost of migrating and converting that data may be prohibitive. So organizations will look to abstract information into their new EHR. So they set up a process where they have their clinical staff review charts based on the appointment book. So for my patients that are scheduled 3 days from now or 2 days from now, whatever makes sense operationally, I'm going to go out and my team is going to pull up their information in my legacy system, and I'm going to abstract whatever is pertinent. So I set up rules around that abstraction. Those rules may be based on the specialty, based on the provider. What is the information from that old chart that I want to have available in that new chart around discrete data? What meds am I going to transfer? What allergies am I going to transfer? Things of that nature. It's certainly a more manual process, but it gets you to the same end goal, so that when that patient presents in the clinic that day, there is some information in their new EHR, so I'm not having to treat that patient as a new patient, and I can keep my operational productivity up when I've made that transition. Whenever we're talking about discrete data conversions, we have to be worried about vocabulary. Is the data coded the same way in the old system than the new system? So for my medications, are both of my systems using the same medication database, for example? Not always the case. And in which case, then how do I convert that data to the new system? Is my vendor going to support me in translating that information from one data set to another? Is that something that's going to fall upon me as an organization to make that translation? How is that going to function? That's something you need to look at when you're putting together that plan on the conversion of data from one to the other. Mapping of data from the old system to the new system. Some things aren't codified as cleanly in the system. Histories, for example, social history is a great example where there really not a lot of coding that's done on social history traditionally in these EHR systems. So do I have to map this data manually from my old system to my new system? Extending that thought process a little further, is the data represented the same way in my new system? Right? Does it make sense if I bring this data over to my new system? Is it something that makes sense from a patient perspective, from treating that patient's perspective? Social history is a great example. Systems have different ways that they capture social history. Is the way my legacy captured it really amenable to me transferring that data over to my new system? Or do I have to have some sort of a abstracting model put into place here to deal with it? Because you may find that you can't convert the data because it just doesn't make sense to programmatically move that data from the old system to the new system. Same with the practice management side. This is an opportunity to clean up data from the old system. Are there any data issues that I need to deal with where I can clean up data from one system to the other? Is there data duplication? Do I have third-party processes in my legacy system that cause me to duplicate data in the system? And this is a good time to clean that out and make sure that the data I'm bringing into my new system is as clean as it can be.
I have a question for you, Vic. So
Yeah,
will my EHR vendor help me get this data to the new system, or who does this?
that's a great question. We'll talk about that in a couple of minutes. But yeah, this is something that you'll have to think through as part of that process. And I'm going to hold my answer to that till we get to that here in a couple of minutes.
Okay,
So
sounds good.
just hold that thought. From a document data perspective, there are decisions that you'll have to make around that. Document data tends to be a lot larger than the discrete data that we just talked about. So you're going to take up a chunk of space storing this document data from your legacy system in the new system. So you need to start thinking about operationally, how much of that data do I need? So at this point, we're looking at it from an operational perspective only. So can I make decisions where I'm only bringing over 3 years worth of document data? Do I really need data that's older than that in my new system? Bringing over everything can tend to clutter charts in the new system, right? So you've got all this legacy data that's already sitting on the chart before you start using it. Is this a time that I can really make some decisions that make sense operationally to me? There's generally some mapping involved in this process as well around document types, the way documents are stored in the new system versus the old system, you generally have to map document types over and bring that information in there. Once you've kind of talked about the data that I'm going to be mapping over and my plan for how I'm going to bring that data over, the next step is, how do I get that data? The question that Holly just brought up a second ago. This is a difficult concept. It depends on your situation. It depends on your vendor. It depends on whether it's cloud hosted or it's hosted by your organization as to how easy it is to get to that data. Sometimes there's a manual process involved. You're exporting data out of the patient's chart from your old system to bring into your new system. Sometimes the vendor will assist you with some sort of an automated process. So the vendor will run a data export. This is often the case with cloud-based vendors, where your data is sitting in a cloud. It's mixed in with data from every other client of that cloud vendor. And so there's no real clean way for you to go in and get that data. The vendor will often offer a data export as part of their contract with you, so that when you terminate services with them, they're going to export that data and give it to you. The downside to that is you often don't get a choice on how that data looks when they export it and give it to you. It's their standard format for exported data, and you're going to have to deal with that format, and you may have to do some data translations, some data manipulation on that in order to make it importable to your new system. You can bring in third parties to do data extraction. This is a service that we as an organization offer, and there are a number of organizations that do that. We can go in and extract data from these EHRs. Again, depending on how that EHR is housed, will dictate the feasibility of doing that. A new area that's coming into play are APIs. As vendors are exposing APIs to users, an API allows you to programmatically talk to your EHR system in a very simplified description of what that does. Really not the focus of this talk, but it is something new that's being offered. So it may be something that you want to think about as part of your strategy for data extraction. Am I able to leverage APIs from my legacy EHR vendor to extract this data from that EHR system? Once I've figured out how I'm going to get that data out of the system, what is that data going to look like? We generally see it fall into a few categories. Probably one more that I should have added here is a straight database dump. We do have some vendors that will just dump the data to a database backup, and they give you a backup of that database. CCDAs are often used for discrete data. So they export CCDAs on every patient in your system, or maybe it's a manual process where you're exporting CCDAs on that patient. And those CCDAs are going to contain the discrete data for that patient, things like medications, lab results, immunizations, vitals. All that discrete data is going to be housed in that CCDA document. You may be dealing with flat files, CSV files, comma separated, or maybe even fixed length files for some vendors, where they're going to export by data type into a flat file. So a demographic file, an appointment file, a medication file, an allergy file, for all of the different information that's available there. And then for the document-based data, you're generally going to see things like PDFs, maybe image files, JPEGs, TIFFs, things like that. Document files, Word document formats are sometimes exported from systems that are available there. So you're generally going to see the data kind of fall into these categories in terms of how that's exported from the system. So once I've got the data, how do I bring that into my new environment? There are certainly cases where manual imports are done. Often around CCDAs, I'm going to manually import that CCDA to my new EHR. The import of the CCDA may be automated, but then there may be some manual steps that are required by me after that. So some sort of a reconciliation that I have to go through with that data that's come in from the CCDA. It's sitting in a holding tank on that patient's record, just like any CCDA would bring data in to my EMR, and then I have to make some decisions on what data I want to bring in. Some EHRs have rules that you can set up around that import of data from the CCDA so that it automatically brings that data into the patient's environment. My image and document files, maybe I'm manually importing those in to the patient record. Then there's certainly automated ways of doing this as well. The EHRs themselves often provide tools for importing data into the EHR, whether it's Excel or CSV type data, flat files to bring in, different types of files that they can import in. They have processes to do that. The vendor themselves may do the import for you. So they may take the data, they may prescribe a format for that data. So they're going to say they want allergies to look like this type of file, and they want medications to look like this. And then they'll take those files and they'll import that data into their environment. Maybe they want the data in an HL7 format so that they can import that data into their environment. You can use third parties, again, to handle the import side of the house as well. Again, services that we offer and a number of other vendors do that as well, to be able to import that data into your new EHR system. And then finally, APIs come back into play. To be able to use an API on my new EHR system to import data and bring that in is a possibility as well. It's certainly becoming more commonplace every day as we're dealing with more and more API usage. These APIs were mandated with meaningful use and having certified EHR technologies. And so all these certified EMR systems are now providing APIs of some sort. The requirement for certification are patient-facing APIs. So that may not be useful for you in this case of importing data or exporting data from my EHR, because it's really not a patient-facing situation. But often the vendors are providing additional APIs for the clinics themselves to be able to leverage and to deal with that data. So don't discount this as a methodology to use. It's certainly becoming more and more common, and you may find that it becomes more and more powerful for your organization to use when doing data imports and exports as well. So that kind of wraps up our discussion on the data from an operational perspective from the EHR. Oh, I forgot this one topic, sorry. In terms of making that plan on how I'm going to convert and migrate data from an operational perspective, there's an important thing to consider, and that's where is this legacy system coming from? We see this broken out into two categories, right? It's either a replacement, so I'm moving from EHR vendor A to EHR vendor B, and I'm going to move my organization to that new EHR vendor, and that's going to become my application moving forward. So in this case, you're dealing with a new system that's generally configured for the workflows of your organization, right? So you're building that new environment based on your current workflows. Well, your old system was based on those same workflows as well. And so your mapping for conversion can generally be a lot easier in this situation, because your existing workflows are what's going to be built into your new environment. So you often have corresponding elements in your new environment for mapping purposes around appointments, around any user-defined, user-created things that exist there. You're going to find it's a little more streamlined. It's a little easier process to do that. The other area where organizations end up with legacy systems is acquisitions. Whether they're acquiring a practice and that practice is coming onto their EHR and now you've got their old legacy system, or your practice got acquired and you're moving to a new system that the person that acquired you was running, and it's already up and running and you're moving into that environment. In that scenarios, workflows don't often match, right? So the way that practice was performing, the workflows they'd created, the way their system was built won't often match what I'm coming into. So that may make conversion a little more difficult in that process. It may even make it impossible. One of the biggest use cases that we're seeing is cases where organizations are moving into a hospital-provided EHR, or they're acquired by the hospital, and they have very little flexibility on the EHR itself and how things are stored in that EHR, and whether or not historic data can be brought into the EHR. And if that's the case, then operation access to the old data kind of melds into the legal access to the old data, because now you need that old data both operationally and legally, because I'm not able to convert that data and bring it over to my new environment. And so it becomes that legal process that you go through becomes even more important, because now there are operational considerations that come into play with that as well. That's my segue into legal compliance, right? So because now, if that's the scenario I'm dealing with, I'm not able to convert any of that data from my historic system to the new system because of things that are out of my control. Now I'm dealing with that legal issue as well as an operational issue in keeping that data and making that data available to my team. So from a legal perspective, there are requirements to maintain and keep your old legacy EHR system. There's no getting around that. You have to have, I'm sorry, not to keeping the old system, but keeping the data available from the old system. The requirements are all over the map. There's no way I can put a slide together detailing those requirements for what you would need to do as an organization in terms of keeping the data from that legacy system. Just to kind of give you a overview, there are federal requirements that are involved, especially if you're involved with federal payment programs, Medicare being the large one there. In general, for adults, there's a 7-year retention period for this data. If you're dealing with Medicare Advantage plans, that bumps up to 10 years on the requirement for maintaining that data. There are other federal requirements that come into play based on the facility type and the patient type. Some of them are as large as 75 years in terms of data retention, based on the different federal programs that you might be dealing with and providing these healthcare services. There are also varying requirements from a state-to-state basis, and those requirements vary depending on patient age. So there are a different set of requirements for pediatric patients than there are for adult patients, and there are even different sets of requirements based on the diagnosis of the patient. Right, so based on the condition that that patient was being treated for, you may find that your state has different retention requirements for those medical records from your legacy system. Check with your state agencies to determine minimums for your organizations. Check with your legal counsel in terms of what those minimum requirements would be for retention of those records. It does vary from organization to organization based on their patient population, based on the state that they're in, based on the programs that they participate in. And so there's no easy answer for this question. I've got a couple of references on this slide. You'll see this when you get the slides and the recording that provide great summaries of these retention requirements and the variability. The first one looks at every state and kind of gives a brief overview of the baseline statutory requirements on a state-by-state basis for medical record retention. The second one sort of talks about it in a more general perspective from a federal level in terms of retention requirements, but great resources when you're trying to make that decision on what is the retention requirement for my legacy system. And it could vary depending on your legacy system, right? Especially if you're dealing with acquisition use cases. If I'm acquiring EHRs, and that retention would depend on the use of that EHR by that that organization, right? What are the products they're dealing with? What is the patient population they're dealing with? That could dictate the retention for that legacy, and it could be different than another legacy system that you acquire. So you really need to be mindful to make sure that you understand what those minimal requirements are for compliance. So how do I do that? How do I meet that minimal compliance requirement? I've broken this out into 4 main categories. There's certainly hybrid approaches for dealing with this as well that cross these categories, but from a explanation perspective, kind of looking at the different options, it makes the most sense to break them out into these 4 categories, and we'll talk about each one in detail here. The first is your legacy system itself, right? Keeping that legacy system, keeping the data in there till I meet those statutory requirements. The second option is archiving the data into a digital environment. So I archive that legacy data so that it's available, it meets my legal requirements, and I'm able to access that data through that archive. The third option is to invoke a third party. There are third-party organizations that become stewards of this legacy data for you. So they manage that process, and we'll talk about that in a little more detail when we get there. And then finally is what I call cold storage, and this is basically storage by the organization itself. There are third parties that do this as well, but it's basically the same concept for dealing with this information. So let's kind of go through each one of these in details and talk about pros and cons associated with each one. So the legacy system itself, I'm going to keep that legacy system up and running in a read-only mode. It's critical that you think about this in a read-only fashion, because you certainly don't want your organization charting information into that old EHR. Now, depending on your legacy EHR, the ability to flip that into a read-only mode varies dramatically. It's very easy in some legacy EHRs. It's very difficult in others. So you may have to put some operational guidelines around this to make that legacy system read-only. It may not be possible to do it from the application's perspective. You may have to have workflows assigned and make sure that there's processes in place to check to make sure that new data is not being added to that legacy EHR. It's often a scaled down implementation. You certainly don't need as robust an environment as you had when it was your live system, when it becomes your legacy storage of that clinical data for meeting these statutory requirements. You can restrict access to that system for compliance purposes. So once I've run my AR out, once I've dealt with the operational need for that legacy system, I can drastically limit who has access to that system so that I'm keeping it for compliance purposes only, and a very small subset of people in my organization have access to that system to be able to access that data. So what are the pros? It's complete access to all the data from my legacy system, right? It's the data as it's sat in my legacy system. So I'm not worried about fidelity of the data. I'm not worried about loss of any data from any process that occurs to house that data for the long term. In terms of dealing with the release of information requests, that's done the exact same way your team was doing it when they use that legacy system. So they're familiar with it. They know how that process functions. There's no learning curve associated with it for them. The users are already very, very familiar with the system. The biggest con is it's expensive. It's expensive to pay for 2 systems or 3 systems or 4 systems as you have multiple of these legacy systems in your environment. Some sites will stop paying for support on that legacy system. They'll kind of roll the dice and say, hey, I'm not going to pay for support. I'm just using this for compliance purposes only. I'm not going to do any upgrades of that data. I'm not going to do anything like that. So I'm going to stop the support process. There is a risk associated with that. If there's a issue that causes the system to be unoperable, I'm going to have a risk of losing data that I have legal requirement to be able to maintain. So something to do with a lot of a thought going into it in terms of, do I want to stop paying for support on that system so that I can save the cost associated with it, but run the risk of potentially having data loss that happens if I'm unable to access that system for whatever reason, and I'm not able to get support to do so. Archiving. Here, data is extracted from the legacy system and stored in an archive. With all of these archive systems, the clinic has searchable access to the old data, so it can meet operational requirements as well, so I can access the data. A lot of these archive systems can be embedded right into the new EHR system, so your staff accesses it directly from the new EHR. So now I can address those operational needs if I'm unable to convert the data, or maybe if I'm using an archive for my legal compliance, I don't need to convert as much data operationally because I can make that data available to my users from within my new EHR, and they're able to access that information. So I don't need to convert as much data, and maybe there's some cost saving that I can realize as a result of that. The records a release of information is handled by your own staff. So they go into the archive system and they release the information that needs to be released. If you're dealing with multiple legacy systems, this can be really useful for your organization because it's the same workflow in the archive regardless of the legacy system involved. So your team is using a singular workflow for releasing information and accessing information from all of these different legacy systems that are out there. So you get a cost savings and you get a potential operational cost savings because your workflows are similar. Your training of your staff is similar across different legacy systems. So you may not need as much staff to handle these the legacy compliance issues that I'm dealing with. The cons that are here, there are costs associated with archiving systems. They're generally not as much as as maintaining the legacy system, but there are costs there still that you have to deal with. It is a new system, so your staff would have to learn how to use the new system and be able to get to that data, get to the export of that data if there's a release of information required in there. Third parties for storing this data. In this scenario, these third parties basically exist to manage the legal compliance of clinical data. They exist in a paper world. They exist in a digital world as well. It's hands-free to the clinic. The data is extracted from your legacy EHR and it's sent to the third party, and then they assume all responsibility for dealing with that data and fulfilling release of information requests. Those requests generally go directly to the third party. They may be routed to that third party from your website for patients that are interested in getting access to their old records, or the request is forwarded by your organization to that third party to be able to fulfill that request. One of the cons of dealing with these third parties is there's generally very limited access to the data or no access at all. So operationally speaking, your organization will have very limited access to that legacy data. So if I've met all my operational requirements through conversion and running out my legacy system, then this becomes a viable option. I don't need to get to that old data. The old data is just there for legal compliance and meeting requests from for release of information. Then the third party becomes a viable option for me. Generally, these third parties, the costs are based on the volume of data. So if you have a lot of data, these third parties can become quite expensive in dealing with it, and often become more expensive than an archived approach or something like that, for example. The last option is what I'm calling cold storage, which is basically I'm going to do it all myself in-house. I'm going to get that extract of the data from my EHR vendor, and I'm just going to store that extract of data. I'm going to make sure it's backed up so that if I have an outage, I have the ability to restore it. So I have that data and I'm keeping it digitally. It's certainly the cheapest option for the clinic in dealing with this. The cons, the data is not searchable, so it's limited in its utility. Depending on how it's exported from my legacy vendor, that data is going to sit in that format, and it's not going to be readily usable for my organization. Release of information can be cumbersome because I have to search through that data for things that I need. It generally involves looking through some sort of a spreadsheet to find the information associated with my patient, and then grabbing the appropriate documents that tie to that patient. Again, depending on how the data is exported from that vendor, it could sit in different ways, PDFs versus CCDAs versus some HTML we've seen from vendors that have exported. We've seen Excel files from vendor exports. So there could be different ways of getting to that data to release that information, but it certainly can meet your compliance aspects. Like I said earlier, there are hybrid approaches to this. It may make sense to do the legacy initially while I'm running out the AR, then maybe move to an archive when I have a lot of release of information requests happening. And then after a period of time when those release of information requests die down, maybe cold storage is the right answer. So I move that into cold storage so I don't have to worry about that data. I'm not getting release of information requests very often. My users aren't accessing the archive to look at that data. So it can really just sit there and I could deal with those one-off requests on a very manual basis when they happen. But some combination will generally meet the needs of your organization for meeting that compliance that I'm dealing with. That's the information that I wanted to go over today. We'll open for any questions that might be out there.
I have just a couple more for you, Vic. Okay, so one question, can't I just keep my old server from my old EHR?
Yeah, that's exactly the what I talked about a little earlier in terms of rolling the dice. You certainly can. Depending on how your EHR is licensed, if it's a perpetual license for the EHR, you certainly have the right to continue using that EHR in that scenario. If you're using your EHR as sort of a SaaS model, which software as a service, which a lot of vendors are doing as well, then you will lose that right to access the EHR if you stop paying your legacy vendor. But even in that perpetual license model where I'm going to have the right to continue to use my EHR, the risk that you run is if there's any issue that's not supported by your vendor, you may lose the ability to access that data. And so you need to kind of factor that risk in to making that decision.
Okay, and then one other, let's see, my new EHR vendor does not want to allow old clinical data into the system. So what are my options?
Yeah, that is unfortunately a common thing that we're seeing, especially with hospital-based acquisitions, where you're moving into a hospital instance of their ambulatory EHR if you're an ambulatory organization. You have very little flexibility on bringing data into that new system. Generally, they'll do demographic conversions, maybe appointment conversions in there. Sometimes they won't do any clinical data conversions at all. And so in that scenario, the operational access to that data becomes part of your compliance decision because you want to be able to still get to that data. Archiving becomes a very viable option because of the ability to embed that into the EHR system so that you can access that archive directly from there. In some cases, the hospital vendor won't do that. They won't integrate that archive into their system, in which case then you need to think that through and figure out operationally what kind of access you need to that old data and how is it best to deliver that access to your users.
Okay, that's all I've got.
Great.
Anybody else
Well,
have any following questions? I think that's it.
well, thanks everyone for the time.
And yes, just as a reminder, everybody will receive an email with links to the recording and the slides. If anybody wants to follow up with us, feel free to reach out to your direct sales rep if you know who that is. If not, feel free to go to info@emedapps.com and we're happy to get you some further assistance.
Thanks everyone.
Have a great day.